Before we get to the U.S. election, I want to get your take on this election domestically and what we saw with this LDP shock. Do you see this having any sort of implications for foreign policy in Japan?
First of all, we didn't expect that. We thought that the LDP would lose its majority, and with that, I think that many of us that are looking at the Japan-U.S. relationships feel that the U.S. was already prepared for this result, as well as other friends and allies of Japan. The USJapan Alliance is really the cornerstone of Japan's security. Japan continues to invest heavily in that relationship, both in terms of joint leadership, but also in terms of expanding that defense partnership throughout the region. And really, whether it's a Harris or it's a Trump in the office, these trends are going to continue. The question for the United States and like-minded partners is really to think about how erratic or more domestically focused Japanese relationship and domestic politics is going to impact Japan's ability to lead in the region.
Okay, do you see, well, let's talk domestic then, since that seems to be where we're going, at least initially here. Professor Nagy, do you think, right now, I think it's the last time the LDP did not have a majority was 15 years ago. Do you think that it in some way handicaps the ability for Japan to maintain regional leadership here?
Well, the LDP is going to have to form a coalition with some of the opposition parties. And that means that the opposition parties are going to focus on domestic politics, the issues that matter to ordinary Japanese, such as inflation, such as issues regarding low birth rates. Even the cost of university education is of a concern for the ordinary Tanaka and Suzuki. So those opposition parties are going to work hard to put their agenda on some kind of coalition. And that means that the LDP is going to be less focused on foreign policy and much more focused on trying to hobble coalitions together to get some support for domestic policies that have some concrete takeaways for the ordinary citizen.
And obviously, when you talk about the U.S.-Japan relationship, you have to talk about how Sino-Japanese relations has been. I mean, it's a very complicated relationship. There's the security angle to all this and the defense ties. And then there's the trade partnership that Japan and China has. Talk through these complexities and how does Japan navigate through both?
So you're right. You know, last year, despite record unfavorable ratings in Japan of China, there was about $380 billion of bilateral trade. And that trade is by and large equal. That means that both China and Japan are benefiting from this relationship, and they're somewhat dependent on each other. Moreover, there's about 20,000 small and medium-sized Japanese enterprises in China. That means they're hiring hundreds of thousands of ordinary Chinese. They're providing that human capital building and training, and of course the transfer of some technology. This means that the Chinese economy is somewhat dependent on the Japanese economy, and the Japanese economy continue to engage. And vice versa. We see Chinese businesses and Chinese citizens buying Japanese products. And that's going to continue. So what we think is that, you know, there's limits to the securitization of the Japan-China relationship because they're mutually dependent on each other. But that being said, there's real challenges in the relationship, whether it's the Taiwan Strait issue and how Japan has really voiced their concerns about, you know, what happens to Taiwan matters to Japan's security. And of course, for the Chinese, they're worried about increasing coordination between the United States and Japan and other countries in what China understands as its backyard. So those tensions are really obvious, but so are the complementariness of the economies, making dealing with the hard issues much more complicated.
Yeah, Professor, I think to your point, right, this is a multifaceted relationship. It's almost like Japan, correct me if I'm wrong, is having its cake, or keki, I think in Japanese, is having its cake and eating it too, right? Maintaining that security relationship with the U.S., but at the same time, there's this economic relationship that is increasingly year by year skewed more towards Japan and China. And I'm wondering how strong you think the U.S.-Japan alliance can remain amidst that economic reality.
So I'm very confident in the U.S.-Japan alliance. The reality is that the U.S. and Japan have many, many, many layers to the relationship, whether it's the defense partnership, whether it's technology exchanges, whether it's university exchanges, many, many different levels of relations that make Japan-U.S. relations robust, resilient and able to withstand some of the dynamics that occur between the two states. A good old example of that is how Japan managed the former Trump administration. Relations deepened. They did have challenges in terms of some trade relations, but again, relations deepened, and that was because of the comprehensiveness of the partnership. In contrast, Japan-China relations, unfortunately, have been really much a one-hit band. They've deepened their economic relationships, but they haven't been able to work through some of the real difficult sides of the relationship: security, history, and their mutual threat perceptions.
What should I expect in terms of chip controls?
Yeah.
Obviously, the U.S. has pressured Japan to strengthen their supply chains, but it seems like the country is still a bit hesitant to really expand some of these chip controls. Is that likely to remain the case?
So I think Japan is very much on the same page of the book as the United States in terms of concerns about, the vanguard chips that are being produced by the Taiwanese manufacturing semiconductor company. There's a clear understanding that the PLA, China's People's Liberation Army, is pursuing what they call civil-military fusion, so using all of those technologies that we benefit from to enhance the PLA's capability to be a 21st century modern military fighting force. And with that in mind, they're thinking about reunification of Taiwan. They're thinking about dominating the South China Sea. And they're really thinking about, over the long term, how they can remove the U.S.-led security architecture within the Indo-Pacific and in East Asia. And with that, I think the Japanese and the United States are going to find a way to cooperate on limiting technologies and limiting semiconductors. And don't forget, limiting experts going into China to prevent them from acquiring those top-tier technologies and semiconductors to bolster their AI and quantum computing technologies that will make them an effective and competent competitor to the United States and Japan.
Yeah, I'm glad Yvonne brought up the point of semiconductors, because that's both a political and a commercial consideration, if you think about it from Japanese corporates, for example. Professor, do you see Japanese chip makers or across the supply chain of chips falling in line easily with what the U.S. wants as far as this conversation goes?
So these conversations started about 4 or 5 years ago, and the Japanese government adopted several supplementary budgets, even at the beginning of the pandemic, to encourage Japanese suppliers to relocate to Japan or start to build different formulas of cooperation. So we've seen the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Netherlands, the United States, and Taiwan start to relocate some of those top-tier semiconductor manufacturing plants. You can find them in Kyushu, at the southern island of Japan, and you can find them in other parts of the world. That's going to continue. And at the same time, we're seeing that Japanese technology manufacturers are finding a way to selectively diversify away from the Chinese market, but still be embedded in those less technological fields. So they're having their cake and eating it too, being part of the market, trying to take advantage of the 400 million middle-class Chinese consumers, but at the same time try to wall off those sensitive areas so those technologies really aren't going into the PLA's military modernization.
Professor, final question for you. You mentioned a couple of minutes back that one of the wobbles between the relationship between the U.S. and Japan during Trump 1.0 was in trade. And if indeed, of course, Donald Trump does take the White House again, it's a big if, he's been talking a lot about tariffs, right? Mostly against China, but he hasn't singled out China only. That might apply to Japanese and Japanese car makers. What is the conversation on the ground amongst corporate Japan? Is there a sense that tariffs are about to go up, and is Japan prepared for tariffs to go up, if indeed that is the case?
So what we saw under the Trump administration is that the Japanese and the Americans came to an understanding of a mini trade deal. And this was a way of the Japanese to, again, defer to some of Mr. Trump's wishes on trade, open up the market to a certain extent, and relieve some of the pressure that they could have got from the Trump administration. I think they'll take a similar strategy, understanding that, it's not the win that you have, it's the number of wins versus the number of losses. And I think what we'll see is that the Japanese will probably put on the table some kind of they'll accept some of the sanctions and increase in trade tariffs if they can carve out some protection in other industries. I think Japan will also highlight, not only corporate Japan, but Japan in general, that it's the key asset for the United States if it wants to have a successful competition with China. And by penalizing Japan in terms of tariffs, that it will only weaken the United States' ability to outcompete China. And that's going to be the message to a potential President Harris, but it will be the message to a potential President Trump who doesn't like to lose.